At exactly 2:17 a.m. Tehran time, the graphs went flat. Internet traffic from Iran collapsed almost simultaneously across major monitoring platforms. No announcement, no warning, just absence. In the hours that followed, journalists, analysts, and diaspora communities refreshed their screens endlessly, waiting for data that did not return. The blackout was not total, but it was precise. Mobile networks degraded first, fixed broadband followed, international gateways narrowed to a trickle. By dawn, Iran had entered what its citizens have learned to recognize as a familiar state: informational isolation. But this time, it was deeper, colder, more deliberate. The protests had already been underway for days. What began as scattered demonstrations over prices and currency collapse had merged into something larger, harder to define. The slogans had changed, the targets had changed. At this stage, the state did not speak. It acted. Security forces moved before cameras could record them. Arrests happened at night, streets were cleared before sunrise. Hospitals were instructed not to release numbers. Families were told to stay silent. By the time the sun rose over Tehran, the story had already been buried beneath interference, censorship, and fear. This documentary begins not with explosions or speeches, but with silence. Because silence in Iran is never empty. It is engineered.
The Iranian government has imposed an internet blackout and cut off many telephone services.
But with 95% of internet access shut down by the government,
in the first 10 days of unrest, information still escaped. Not freely, but persistently. Videos appeared in fragments, shaky footage, faces blurred, gunshots in the distance, a crowd scattering under street lights, a body carried out of frame. The channel was unexpected. Satellite-based internet beyond state infrastructure. For a brief window, it worked. By the third night, the government understood the threat. Not the protests themselves, but visibility. Revolutions are not fueled by numbers alone. They are fueled by being seen. At this point, the state escalated. Jamming stations activated across major urban centers. Frequencies were flooded. Signals distorted. Connections dropped mid-sentence. Then came confiscation, door to door, rooftop to rooftop. Equipment labeled foreign was removed. Possession became evidence. Evidence became arrest. By day 10, the flow slowed to a drip. By day 12, nearly nothing moved. What remained were rumors, numbers without confirmation, names without faces. And then the reports began to surface. From outside Iran, anonymous officials, human rights groups, leaks. The estimates varied wildly. Hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands. Inside Iran, there were no numbers. Only funerals conducted quietly. Only families warned not to speak. At this stage, the protest was no longer visible. But it had not ended. It had gone underground. When information disappears, violence accelerates. This pattern is not unique to Iran. It has been observed repeatedly across authoritarian systems. Darkness lowers restraint. According to later disclosures, the deadliest period began after the blackout, not before. Without cameras, crowd control shifted to suppression. Live ammunition replaced deterrence. Detention centers overflowed. Field interrogations became routine. Hospitals were instructed to categorize deaths as accidents. Families were pressured to bury quickly. Some bodies were never returned. International organizations attempted to track casualties remotely through satellite imagery, refugee testimony, intercepted communications. The ranges they produced were broad but consistently high. What matters is not the precise number. What matters is the direction. Deaths increased as visibility decreased. By the end of the second week, the uprising had transformed. It was no longer a protest movement in the classical sense. It was a confrontation unfolding beyond observation. At this stage, Iran was no longer managing dissent. It was attempting to erase it. While streets burned quietly in Iran, attention shifted west. Statements from Washington were passed word by word. Tone mattered more than content. Silence mattered most. When the president spoke, he did not announce policy. He issued signals, short messages, open-ended phrases, words designed to be interpreted rather than obeyed. Support was on the way. Responsibility was implied, not stated. Observers compared the rhetoric to past moments: Venezuela, Libya, Iraq. Each precedent carried weight. Each carried warning. Behind the scenes, assessments were ongoing. Military readiness, regional posture, diplomatic cost. Contrary to public perception, intervention is rarely about intent. It is about timing. At this moment, assets were not yet aligned. Carrier groups were elsewhere. Strategic bombers were available, but options were limited. This delay created a vacuum. Inside Iran, protesters faced immediate force. Outside Iran, expectations rose without reinforcement. History shows that this gap between promise and action is often where movements fail. Time does not move neutrally in crises. It favors the prepared. The Iranian state had decades of experience suppressing unrest. Its security architecture was layered, redundant, and loyal. The protesters had momentum, but momentum decays. Fear accumulates faster than courage. Each day without external pressure strengthened the regime's position. Arrests removed organizers, surveillance mapped networks, interrogations produced names. The uprising did not collapse suddenly. It thinned. By the third week, demonstrations were smaller, more localized, more dangerous. At this stage, analysts began using a different language. Not revolution, but endurance. The question shifted from, can the regime fall, to can the people survive long enough for conditions to change? Time here was no longer measured in days, it was measured in casualties. To understand why Iran did not fracture immediately, one must understand its structure. This is not a personal dictatorship, it is a system. Power is distributed across institutions designed to reinforce one another. Religious authority, security forces, courts, economic networks. Loyalty is rewarded materially. Dissent is punished collectively. Over 4 decades, this architecture absorbed war, sanctions, isolation, and internal unrest. The lesson learned by the regime was simple: survive first, reform later. When protests erupted, no senior figure defected publicly. No military unit switched sides. From the outside, this looked like stability. From the inside, it looked like fear functioning as designed. The trigger was not ideology, it was economics. Currency collapse, inflation beyond control, wages rendered meaningless. The protests began in markets, not universities. Among shopkeepers, not activists. This matters. Because economic anger spreads differently, it does not require leadership. It requires hunger. Once teachers, engineers, and civil servants joined, the state recognized the risk. These were not traditional dissidents. These were system participants. At this stage, slogans changed. Demands hardened. Reform was no longer sufficient. This transition from grievance to rejection is the most dangerous phase for any regime. Modern conflict does not begin with gunfire. It begins with narrative. For a brief period, satellite internet disrupted the regime's monopoly on truth. Videos circulated faster than censors could react. Alternative futures were visible. This was not merely communication. It was psychological breach. Once closed, the damage remained. Millions had already seen what was forbidden. Authoritarian systems fear this moment more than bombs. Iran does not exist in isolation. Every movement triggers regional calculations. Some neighbors feared collapse. Others quietly welcomed pressure. No coalition emerged publicly. Silence dominated diplomacy. This ambiguity reflected risk. Intervention carries consequences that rarely stop at borders. History offers a tempting illusion. Remove the leader, end the system. Reality is colder. Systems endure unless multiple layers fail simultaneously. Leadership removal creates opportunity, but not outcome. Without internal fragmentation, collapse does not follow automatically. This understanding restrained action. Cyber pressure, economic leverage, information warfare. These tools operate slowly, invisibly. Their effectiveness depends on time, something protesters lacked. Exiled figures appeared in feeds before the blackout. Symbols of an alternative past. Symbols inspire, but they do not govern. Without presence on the ground, legitimacy remains theoretical. By the fourth week, the outcome remained unresolved. Not victory, not defeat. Stalemate under repression. History often records these moments poorly. The absence of footage creates amnesia, but systems remember pressure even when they survive it. This story does not end with resolution. It ends with uncertainty. Iran remains, the regime remains, the anger remains, and somewhere beneath interference and silence, memory waits. Because silence is not the absence of sound, it is the pause before the next rupture.